This is a classifications of connective tissue. So we're breaking down connective tissue. We started with epithelial tissue in previous videos and looked at the way they are designed by their shape and the number of layers. Now we're moving on to connective tissue and just giving a breakdown of the hierarchy and how we classify them. Remember, 4 types of tissues in the body: epithelial, connective, muscle, and nervous. Now we can take connective tissue and we can break it down into 3 types: proper, fluid, and supporting. Just like everything else in the class, then we can further break those down. So we're just going to briefly discuss those and then we'll get into the histology in later videos. This is the point to where I was already lost in the class. And you got to remember to go back to the basics. We talked about levels of organization. You get to chemicals, cells, tissues. 4 types of tissues. Now we're on connective. Now we're learning 3 types of connective. So proper, fluid, and supporting, but we can break down proper into 2 types, loose and dense, and that's describing the physical nature of how it's designed. We'll talk about what these cells in connective tissue proper make in another video when we talk about the matrix, because the matrix includes protein fibers. They're making these fibers, and the way the tissue is designed, sometimes it's loosely spread out, sometimes it's more dense relative to each other, so it's describing those. So 2 types of proper, loose and dense, 3 types of loose, 3 types of dense. So 3 types of loose: areolar, adipose, and reticular. So areolar, we find, it's widespread, but we find it in the dermis, specifically at the papillary of the dermis, so just deep to the epidermis. We'll come back to that. Adipose tissue is our fat. So we find that in the hypodermis when we go through integumentary system. We find it around areas of insulation and cushion. We think about our buttocks, around our breasts. And then reticular is like a framework of organs. We see it in liver, spleen, and the kidneys, and it provides a structural framework for the organ. Then dense. Once we get more dense, now it's a little bit more for strength. Loose allows for a little bit of flexibility, so the structure creates the function. Dense, now we're going on to more strength. Regular and irregular. When we look at regular, it's how the fibers and cells are designed. They're more in a regular pattern, a consistent pattern, almost like a rope. Irregular, the fibers are going all over the place. So it's describing again the physical makeup. Regular, we see in tendons and ligaments. Tendons connect muscle to bone, and ligaments connect bone to bone. And in those areas, we need a lot of strong tensile strength for that movement and that leverage in conjunction with our muscles. Irregular, again, a little bit more stretching. When we see a transition and move around a little bit, it allows for movement. We see this again in the dermis. It's about 80% of the dermis, and this is in our reticular layer of the dermis, and that is made up of dense, irregular connective tissue. Elastic tissue, a little bit more rare. We see it in vertebrates. We see it around some of our blood vessels, but again, a little bit for strength, but also stretching. So that's our 2 types of proper, loose and dense. Fluid, 2 types, blood and lymph. We'll talk about these more when we get to the cardiovascular system for blood, and for lymphatic system we'll talk about lymph. But the way we design them is foreign elements is just a special way of saying the cells of these tissues. So the cells include primarily 3 things. As a broad perspective, erythrocytes are my red blood cells, which help me to carry that oxygen, carbon dioxide. So erythrocytes are red blood cells. Leukocytes are all my white blood cells that help me with illness and disease and immunity. Platelets, they're not cells, they're fragments of cells, but they help with clotting and protecting us so we're not bleeding uncontrollably. So platelets for clotting. So those are all our fluid connective tissues. And then we get into supporting 2 types, cartilage and bone. And we think of supporting like supporting the skeleton of the body. For cartilage, there's 3 types. So we have hyaline, elastic, and fibrous. Hyaline is referring to it's got a glassy appearance when we look at it, but we see hyaline in support areas. So in my trachea, the rings around my trachea to structurally support it, that's hyaline cartilage. When I look at my ribs and I connect them to my sternum, that tissue in between is a little bit softer, and that's hyaline cartilage. So areas where we have more support. Elastic is where we have stretching. So elastic cartilage A couple good examples. My ears are elastic. No matter what I do with them, move them, they go back to the same spot. So that allows for a little bit more stretching, so elastic cartilage. When I look at my epiglottis is the structure when I swallow to protect my trachea so the food doesn't go down there. It goes down my esophagus. No matter how many times I swallow, it goes back up so I can breathe. So epiglottis is elastic tissue. So more for stretching. Fibrous or fibrocartilage, we see more shock absorption and compression. Intervertebral disc in between my vertebrae is made up of fibrous cartilage. The meniscus in my knees is fibrocartilage. The pubic symphysis or symphysis pubis, the cartilage in between my pubic bones of my hips, as I move and I'm putting weight on my body, this is all shock absorption. So hyaline for support, elastic for stretching, fibro or fibrous for shock absorption compression. And then we get into bone. Now we finally get to where it's hardened material. We'll talk about the matrix more when we get to bone, but we have two types of osseous tissue, compact and spongy. Again, it's describing the physical makeup of how we see the cells and the matrix that it creates. Compact bone is what it is. It's more densely compact versus spongy bone. It's same chemical composition, but now it's a little bit more open. To me, it's just like thinking about a sponge on your sink. When we look at the sponge, I can't see through it, but it is porous. I can run water through it. And when we talked about our primary functions of the skeletal system, we said blood formation is one of its functions. We store blood in the spongy bone. We call that the bone marrow. So it's designed structurally to hold that. Compact is more for that strength. So when we look at connective tissue, three types: proper, fluid, and supporting. You just got to break them down further. And then we'll continue on other videos and looking at the histology or the microscopes of these tissues. This is understanding the makeup of connective tissue. Four types of tissue in the body: epithelial, connective, muscle, and nervous. When we looked at the characteristics or properties of epithelial tissue, one of our characteristics was that it has cellularity. And cellularity means that the cells are tightly packed together relative to the other tissue types. And that structure creates a function. It provides physical protection, but it's also controlling permeability. So cellularity in epithelial tissue, we don't see that in connective tissue. Connective tissue is our most abundant tissue. But the difference with connective tissue is that it creates something. Now these cells become specialized because they create what we call the matrix. And we'll get into that. So we don't see that cellularity. It's less cells and more of the product they build. So their functions, we talked about our breakdown of classifications, the structural framework. We talked about cartilage and bones and tendons and ligaments. Transport fluids. We talked about blood and lymph to move things throughout the body. We said protect the organs, going back to bones is our primary way to do that. Storing energy. Adipose tissue is one of our connective tissue proper, our loose connective tissues. Adipose is a great insulator and a good cushion. And then defense against microorganisms. One of our fluid connective tissues is lymph. And we talked about briefly our leukocytes, which are white blood cells. And we'll get into the different types once we get to the lymphatic system. So basic functions. But connective tissue is really three components. Instead of just cells like cellular and epithelial tissue, now these cells are special. They're specialized. And they're making something called a matrix. And the matrix includes two things: protein fibers and a ground substance. There's three types of protein fibers that we'll see. And then the ground substance is that general material around the cells. So when we look at bones, it's hard. When we look at cartilage, it's a little bit more softer and gelatinous. And then we can see it as a liquid when we look at blood and lymph. So that ground substance and that material changes. So for example, when we get to bone, that ground substance is a lot of calcium phosphate, one of the hardest materials in our body, calcium carbonate, so calcium based. So it just depends on the type of tissue, on the buildup of it. But it's based off the protein fibers to help support it. So specialized cells that make a matrix. When we talk about the specialized cells, we can start naming them, just like we did epithelial tissue. They're called fibroblasts, chondroblasts, osteoblasts. These are general terms to describe, these are the active cells that are blasting off the younger, immature cells that secrete the matrix. So for the fibroblasts, they're making fibers. So the protein fibers are below the primary cells that make fibroblasts. We tend to see them more in connective tissue proper. Remember connective tissue proper, fluid, and supporting from our last video. So fibroblasts are making fibers. Chondroblasts is referring to cartilage. So they're the primary cells that are specialized to make cartilage. Osteoblasts is referring to bone. So osteoblasts are making the bone material. One concept throughout the course that we cover is differentiation. Differentiation is how cells can change over time and their role changes. No different than you as an organism. You change from a baby to a child to a teenager. As an adult, you change jobs, you do different things, you become older. You're the same person, but you've changed over time. That's what happens with these cells. A fibroblast can turn into a chondroblast or an osteoblast, but as the fibroblast gets older, it's called a fibrocyte. It's the same cell, it just got older. So a fibroblast becomes a fibrocyte. A chondroblast becomes a chondrocyte. And an osteoblast becomes an osteocyte. Now there is more of an embryonic stem cell start to this that we'll get into later as we cover the different types of tissues. But for now, the specialized cells, one that secretes the matrix, blasts, fibroblasts, chondroblasts, osteoblasts. They become older and help maintain the tissue. So they're kind of like the parents of the elderly. Once we build the house, they just maintain it. Fibroblasts, chondroblasts, osteoblasts. The fibers that they make. So collagen, reticular, and elastic. Remember, we said these are the primary cells that are making these are fibroblasts because we said specialized cells make a matrix. What's in the matrix? Protein fibers. It's the structural support for the tissue. Collagen is our most abundant. We see that quite a bit. It's because it's strong, gives me that tensile strength. Where we see a lot of the collagen fibers is my tendons and ligaments. Remember, tendons connect muscle to bone and ligaments connect bone to bone. I need that tensile strength to allow for that movement and leverage. So we see a lot of collagen fibers. You hear that term collagen a lot when we talk about like the skin and the makeup of when we get like lotions and things to take care of our hair and our skin. Reticular. Remember we learned the specific type of dense connective tissue and connective tissue proper. Remember we learned one of our reticular tissues and connective tissue proper. We see reticular tissue, it creates a framework for liver, spleen, kidneys. So when I look at it, it's like a mesh that helps create the support of the organ so it can carry out some of its functions. And then elastic fibers we see in areas of stretching. Another good example we use is blood vessels, specifically the arteries. As they pump blood, they have to allow for that movement of stretching to expand and contract so we can allow the different type of pressure of the blood going through. So connective tissue is different than epithelial tissue. No cellularity. Instead, we have cells that are making something. What's that called? The matrix. The matrix includes these specialized cells that are making a product that's called the fibers and ground substance. The primary fibers that we see are protein fibers, collagen, reticular, and elastic. This is connective tissue. Areolar connective tissue. 4 types of tissue in the body. Epithelial, connective, muscle, and nervous. 3 types of connective tissue proper, fluid, and supporting. Under connective tissue proper, we have 2 types, loose and dense. Our first type of loose connective tissue we're learning is called areolar connective tissue. We're learning in the histology. To me, when I look at it, I see just a bunch of sticks, like I'm looking at the kindling for a campfire. Doesn't have to make sense to you, but you just remember Brad thinks this looks like just a campfire bunch of sticks. Because when we did epithelial tissue, I said squamous cells look like fried eggs. I said cuboid looks like a pearl necklace when we create the tube. When we look at columnar, I said they're rectangles or fingers. Now we get into connective tissue. Remember, they're specialized cells that make a matrix, so we don't have that cellularity anymore. Cellularity is when the cells bunch all together. Now we have the cells that are producing product. That's the matrix, and that includes our protein fibers. Those are the sticks that we see in this slide. Where do we see areolar connective tissue? Since we start out the class with covering integumentary system, the first part of the dermis is areolar connective tissue. So this is all dermis, but this first layer, which is about 20% of the dermis, about finger width when I teach it on the model. So this layer is called the papillary layer. All of this section here is papillary layer, type of tissue, areolar connective tissue. So when we look inside the microscope, when we look at the tiny dark dots, those are indicating my cells, fibroblasts, because those are the specialized cells we see making fibers. So fibroblasts are all these dark dots to indicate that we're looking at those cells. Again, the terminology, identify the cells. These are fibroblasts. They make the structures, which are the fibers. The big, thick strings or lines that you see in this slide are collagen fibers. Remember, collagen, elastic, and reticular. So we see collagen and elastic in areolar connective tissue. Allows for movement of the skin, plus give me strength. The structure creates the function. Went on a tangent there. When you look at those bigger, thick strings, these are collagen fibers. Where they look just like hairs running through here, relative to them, the thinner lines, these thin lines are elastic fibers. So the cells, fibroblasts, indicated by the round dots, showing the nuclei. The structures, collagen fibers. When we look at the thick ones, the thinner ones, to me, they look like hairs. These are elastic fibers. Type of tissue, areolar connective tissue. Where do we find it? Papillary layer of the dermis. Histology of adipose tissue. We're looking at one of our types of connective tissue. 4 types of tissue in the body: epithelial, connective, muscle, and nervous. 3 types of connective tissue: connective tissue proper, connective tissue fluid, and supporting. 2 types of connective tissue proper: loose and dense. This is one of our loose connective tissues. Previously in another video, we looked at areolar connective tissue. Now we're looking at adipose tissue, which is our fat supply, our adipose tissue that we see in the hypodermis, around our breasts, around our kidneys to provide that structural cushion, that insulation, that energy supply. Where I show it at the beginning, it's part of the hypodermis. So we learned our epidermis is stratified squamous epithelium. We learned that the dermis contains areolar connective tissue at that papillary layer. In the reticular layer, we learned that's dense, irregular connective tissue. And when we get into the hypodermis, it's primarily adipose tissue. When I look at adipose tissue, to me, it looks like just like a bunch of clear, translucent bubbles. When we did areolar tissue, remember I called it sticks or kindling for a campfire, sticks everywhere. Now I see a bunch of clear white bubbles. What's unique to adipose tissue is when we look at the individual cells, which are adipocytes, that we see at the corner is the nuclei. Almost like it looks like a solitaire diamond ring. So the nuclei tend to sit towards one corner as if I'm holding up a diamond ring. So all these individual bubbles are adipocytes. Notice we have a little bit more cellularity. Anatomy is not perfect across the board, but we try to categorize them based on their structure and function best we can, because we said it's specialized cells that make a matrix. When we look at adipose tissue, it's just a bunch of adipocytes that are put together. So as we look at these individual cells, these are all adipocytes. These cells last quite a while. So we looked at areolar connective tissue, like our fibroblasts. They can live for weeks to months. When we look at adipocytes, they can last for years, sometimes up to a decade, up to 10 years. They shrink in size when we use them, but they don't necessarily go away. They will die off. They do have the ability to regenerate, but that's what makes losing weight difficult to do. Your body's trying to keep that for an energy supply, but if you don't use them, they won't shrivel up and shrink, and then you won't lose that weight. So adipose tissue, I see in the hypodermis, it's full of a bunch of adipocytes, a bunch of clear bubbles. Histology of dense, regular connective tissue. Connective tissue, 3 types: connective tissue proper, fluid, and supporting. For connective tissue proper, we organize them into loose and dense, and we're looking at dense, regular. What do we mean by dense? Remember, connective tissue has specialized cells that make a matrix that includes fibers. So we see this in tendons and ligaments to give us that strength. So dense, regular connective tissue is tendons and ligaments. So it's dense to give us that strength, and they're regularly patterned. To me, it's like looking at a rope that all the twine is nicely organized because it gives us consistent strength. So when we look at this is showing the muscles of the body, skeletal muscles, but the white sections to where we're going to attach to bone, those are going to be tendons. So our tendons include dense, regular connective tissue. To me, it looks like you took just a nice paintbrush stroke. So I took a paintbrush with some pink paint in this case and just swiped it across the slide. When we looked at adipose, a bunch of clear white bubbles. When I look at areolar connective tissue, it looks like a bunch of sticks in a campfire. It doesn't need to make sense to you as long as you remember when you look into a slide, what does it look like to you? It doesn't have to be academic, just to remember the tissue. So the type of tissue, dense, regular, when I see that nice paintbrush stroke, looks a little similar to smooth muscle. So that can be, depending on the slides in your class, can be a little bit ambiguous. But when I look at the nuclei, they're elongated in this case. So all these dark lines indicate the nuclei of what cells? Remember, fibroblasts. Specialized cells. We have fibroblasts, osteoblasts, and chondroblasts. When we look at a lot of connective tissue proper, the cells that make the fibers are fibroblasts. So also remember just the terminology. Identify the cells. The cells are fibroblasts. They make the structures of the matrix, which includes then all of the fibers. So any of that pink, purple that you see out of that includes the fibers. 3 types of fibers: collagen, reticular, and elastic. But we see collagen in tendons and ligaments. So the structures they create are the collagen fibers. So that wavy action are those protein fibers. Collagen fibers are the structures. The cells are the elongated nuclei. Those are fibroblasts. This is dense, regular connective tissue. Fluid connective tissue. This is histology of a blood smear. Remember, this is a connective tissue. There's 3 types of connective tissue. Connective tissue proper, that includes our loose and our dense. Fluid, which is our blood and our lymph, and then supporting cartilage and bone. So here we're looking at blood. And as soon as I see a bunch of pink bubbles, I know that's my blood because 99.9% of all the formed elements of the cells in blood are erythrocytes. And erythrocytes are red blood cells. So all of these pink little bubbles that you see throughout the slide are erythrocytes to transport that carbon dioxide and oxygen. Then I have little specks of dirt throughout, and I highlighted a couple of them as platelets, but just these tiny little specks. Remember, they're just fragments of cells. So these are platelets that we use for clotting. So platelets. And then our leukocytes, which are white blood cells, and there's different types when we get into the lymphatic system. Remember when we looked at formed elements of the slide, the cells, 99.9% of them are erythrocytes. So only 0.1, depending on you and your health status, 0.1% are the leukocytes. So you don't see them as much relative to the erythrocytes. But what I can see is a lymphocyte in this color. So this dark colored staining material is a lymphocyte. And now we have a specialized system for that when we get into things like T cells and B cells in the lymphatic system. So a dark clear bubble is a lymphocyte. Platelets are my tiny dark dots. Neutrophils are my most abundant of my leukocytes, roughly 2/3, 70%. Of all my white blood cells, they're our first responders, so we see them more throughout the body. Neutrophils, but remember, it's only 70% of 0.1% because our leukocytes is only about 0.1%, but again, it depends on your health status at the time. When I see these lobes to them and the way the cells are designed, this nuclei, as I look at the expansions of them, they look like little balls or lobes inside. These are neutrophils. So a solid dark dot is a lymphocyte. The ones that have like lobes or balls inside, these are neutrophils. Remember, you're looking at a fluid connective tissue. This is histology of hyaline cartilage. Hyaline meaning that it looks clear or glassy, because when we look at the slide, some of the cells that we see that are specialized have a glassy appearance to them. We're looking at hyaline cartilage. This is where you start to kind of get confused on where we're at in the class. Always go back to the basics. There's 4 types of tissue in the body: epithelial, connective, muscle, and nervous. When we get into connective tissue, we broke it down to 3 types: connective tissue proper, fluid, and supporting. In supporting connective tissue, we have bone, 2 types of bone, compact and spongy, and then our 3 types of cartilage: elastic, hyaline, and fibrocartilage. Now we're looking at hyaline. It's the most abundant cartilage. And when we look at this type of cartilage, we see it from a supporting standpoint. In our examples here in the picture, when we look at our ribs connecting the sternum to our ribs, this is all hyaline cartilage. So it's supporting, but it's allowing for flexibility. So it's actually the weakest of the three. And then when we look at the tracheal cartilage, the C rings that wrap around the trachea, it gives it that structural support. That's hyaline cartilage. We also see it at the ends of long bones or bones where we have a cavity with movement. So we call that articular cartilage. So we see hyaline cartilage where we have a lot of movement. And as a result, when we look at cartilage, it doesn't have a nerve supply and it doesn't have a blood supply. When we talk about epithelial tissue, we use the acronym CRAP, C-R-A-P, and the A for epithelial tissue meant it was avascular. It doesn't have a direct blood supply. But then we compare that to other tissues. So connective tissue has different types. Bone has a blood supply, but when we look at cartilage, it does not. So when we teach things, it's not exact for everything. We just try to categorize it the way it fits. So cartilage doesn't have a blood supply. It's avascular. It doesn't have a nerve supply, which makes sense because if it's attached to my bones and I continuously use them and it's rubbing, I don't want to have it to where it bleeds or to where it hurts. Now, when that wears down over time, you see like your grandparents complain about their hips, their knees, their elbows. Some of that cartilage is wearing down. Remember, connective tissue is a specialized cells that make a matrix. When we did epithelial tissue, when we talked about cellularity, it's a bunch of cells that are connected together. Now, when we look at connective tissue, you have cells that are making what's called the matrix. Remember, the matrix is two things: protein fibers and its ground substance, the material that makes up the surrounding area. So the matrix is the fibers, three types of fibers: collagen, elastic, and reticular. The most abundant and giving us that tensile strength is collagen fibers. So we see a lot of collagen fibers in cartilage. Some elastic, some reticular, but primarily collagen. When we look at the ground substance, it's made up of polysaccharides or sulfates. When we look at bone, it's more calcium based. So that material that makes it up allows for that flexibility. So now when we get into the cells, remember we said there's chondroblasts and chondrocytes. Blasts are the younger baby cells, B for baby and blast. Chondroblasts are the baby cells that are secreting the matrix. As they get older, they turn into chondrocytes and then they form a bubble around them called a lacunae. So as we look at hyaline cartilage, finally looking at the slide, this is just going in from one magnification to the other. So in the middle here, this is one strip of hyaline cartilage. And to me, it looks like just a bunch of rafts down a river. So as I go down, all of these cells, to me, look like you're riding rafts down a river. That's how I remember it. Because when we looked at certain cells like stratified squamous, simple squamous, epithelium, we're comparing them, but I tend to go back just the basics of what do I see inside the microscope. Simple squamous to me look like fried eggs. Simple cuboidal look like cubes or pearl necklaces. Simple columnar look like columns or fingers to me. Now when I look at something like hyaline cartilage, in my mind I see a bunch of rafts down the river. It doesn't need to make sense to you, but you remember that Brad said it looks like rafts down the river. So all of these rafts down the river are the cells. So the cells, remember the terminology, cells versus structures. Type of tissue, hyaline cartilage. So the tissue, hyaline cartilage, is made up of all these chondrocytes that sit in a lacunae. So it's a bubble within a bubble. So I have these cells, as they get older, they're maintaining the matrix, and these are chondrocytes and lacunae. So as I expand over here, all of these cells, chondrocytes and lacunae. Now the blasts, the baby cells that are secreting the matrix, are towards the periphery or the edge of the tissue. So towards the edge, I have chondroblasts. Two types of cells, chondroblasts, and then chondrocytes in the middle. Remember, they make the matrix. So everything that's not the cells is the matrix. So if we went on a higher magnification, more specifically say with an electron microscope, we could see some of those collagen fibers. And then when we look at the ground substance, the material in between, remember I said they're mostly made up of sulfates. These are polysaccharides, but they help with flexibility, but it also makes them a bit weaker. So as I breathe and I'm expanding the lungs, it's allowing for that flexibility in between the sternum and the ribs. So when we look at hyaline cartilage, two types of cells, chondrocytes in the lacunae. Remember, lacunae is specific to the older cells. Towards the edge, chondroblasts. Type of tissue, hyaline cartilage. We're looking at histology of fibrocartilage or fibrous cartilage. When you start to get into the details of different types of tissue, it's good to go backwards just to make sure you're covering all the vocabulary that leads up to fibrocartilage. So if we get into first the four types of tissue in the body, epithelial, connective, muscle, and nervous. And then for connective, there's three types. When we looked at our previous videos, connective tissue proper, that includes our three types of loose, three types of dense. Then our fluid connective tissue that includes our blood and our lymph. And then supporting connective tissue that includes our cartilage and bone. We learned two types of bone, spongy bone and compact bone. And now three types of cartilage. We've looked at hyaline cartilage, we have elastic cartilage, and now fibrous cartilage. We looked at hyaline when we talked about articular cartilage, the ribs connecting to the sternum, and parts of the trachea. When we look at elastic cartilage, that's part of the epiglottis, and then my ears are elastic cartilage. When we get into fibro, that's actually our strongest cartilage of the three, and it's because it has all those dense collagen fibers to it. Remember, connective tissue is a specialized cell that makes a matrix. The specialized cells are chondroblasts and chondrocytes. Remember, the chondrocytes are in a bubble called a lacunae. And then they make the matrix. And the matrix includes fibers. We talked about 3 protein fibers, elastic, collagen, and reticular. And we see collagen when we need a lot of tensile strength. So where we see fibrocartilage is areas where we need shock absorption or compression. So it's the strongest cartilage primarily because it has a lot of collagen fibers to it and they're densely stacked together. Remember, cartilage doesn't have a blood supply. It doesn't have a nerve supply. It's relative to other types of tissues, but connective tissue can have blood in it. Blood is the connective tissue. Bones has blood in it. But cartilage is one of those rare types of connective tissue that doesn't have a blood supply and nerve supply. So where do we see it? Well, we see it in between our vertebrae. So intervertebral discs are made up of fibrous or fibrocartilage. The meniscus in between my knees is fibrous cartilage. And then here I have part of it put together is the pubic symphysis or symphysis pubis, where I connect my 2 pubic bones or my coxal bones. As I walk and move, I'm putting pressure on my body. So this compresses to give me that shock absorption as I'm running and moving around. It also helps for females during labor and delivery. So those are examples of fibro or fibrous cartilage. When we look at the tissue, most students when in your classes, you'll have very pretty looking slides. And what I mean by that, it has this nice purple, blue, pinkish to it on some of the tissue. When we looked at hyaline cartilage, I focused more on what I call the river rafts, the rafts going down the river, and that's where we looked at hyaline cartilage shows those chondrocytes and the lacunae stuffed in the middle and the chondroblasts towards the edge. We use the same philosophy, but as I look at all of this blue tissue, this is all my cartilage. And then the cells in the middle, towards the middle of the tissue, are chondrocytes. Remember, they're cells within a cell. In other words, I mean cell within a bubble. They enclose themselves within a lacunae. So a chondroblast turns into a chondrocyte. So all of my cells, and the key terminology is understanding what we're asking. The cells, you only have 2 answers. So chondrocytes down the middle. Towards the periphery or the edge, the cells towards the edge are going to be chondroblasts. So 2 types of cells that we would see, remember the chondroblasts, are the younger cells, the baby cells, B for B, that secrete the matrix. So everything that's not the cells is all the matrix. And then you see a little bit of different types of tissue that are expanding and differentiating. Remember we talked about one of the key terms of anatomy is as cells change and they turn into something else. No different than you as a macroorganism, you change over time of who you are. So as I look at this, this is all connective tissue, specifically fibrocartilage. That's the type of tissue, the cells within it, chondrocytes, and then towards the edge, the cells, chondroblasts. This is fibrocartilage. Histology of compact bone. Remember, compact is a connective tissue. 3 types of connective tissue. Connective tissue proper, connective tissue fluid, and supporting connective tissue. Within supporting, 3 types of cartilage, hyaline, elastic, and fibrous. And then 2 types of bone, compact and spongy. Compact meaning the tissue is more dense relative to spongy, that's more porous. Where do we see compact bone? When we look at long bones, we see them towards the periphery. And because it is compact in nature, it's giving us that structural strength. And the way we divide them up is into structural units that we call an osteon. So an osteon, when we look at it microscopically, this is just a picture showing this, but each of these little like tree trunks with a bullseye in it or like a dartboard, these are all osteons. So this picture is showing you 1, 2, 3, and 4 osteons. So when I expand over here, I can see these dark center dots, which are called central canals, also referred to as haversian canals. It's the center of an osteon. So if I compact and put a bunch of osteons together, I get compact bone. So if I circle around them, what I end up seeing circling around are all these tiny little dark dots that indicate my osteocytes. Remember, specialized cells, osteocytes and osteoblasts. Osteocytes will also be in a lacunae as they get older, just like when we covered our cartilage. So osteocytes are the cells that are surrounding all of our structures. And they do it in circles. And you can almost see like rings to them. And we call that concentric lamellae. And it's just how it's developing. We're circling around and creating this entire structure, just like a tree trunk. So the center dark dot where I'd have blood flow, nerve supply, lymph supply, this is a space for that, and that's called the haversian canal or central canal. The cells are called osteocytes, and those are those dark dots. And the other thing to add to it is it almost looks like there's sun rays or eyelashes. If you look at these tiny little lines that come off, you can see them well here. These are all called canaliculi. Canaliculi. These are little canals, canaliculi, and they're connecting my cells, and it's a way of providing a pathway for communication for the cells to allow for that nourishment for them to actively divide to create the tissue. So compact bone is made up of osteons. Osteons include the osteocytes, includes the central canal, and those canaliculi. And the way we create them are a circle within a circle within a circle that we call concentric lamellae. Compact bone. We're covering histology of spongy bone. Remember, there's 2 types of osseous tissue, spongy and compact. As we learn the different types of tissue, remember to understand where we're coming from to get to this point. There's 4 types of tissue in the body: epithelial, connective, muscle, and nervous. There's 3 types of connective tissue proper. That includes our 3 types of loose and our 3 types of dense. Connective tissue fluid, which is our blood and our lymph, and then supporting connective tissue, which is our cartilage and bone. We've covered 3 types of cartilage: hyaline, elastic, and fibrocartilage, and now we're looking at specifically spongy bone, because we have spongy and compact. Remember, it's a connective tissue. When we look at bone, it's specialized cells that make a matrix. And so the specialized cells are osteoblasts and osteocytes. Where do those come from? From mesenchymal cells that turn into or differentiate into osteoprogenitor cells. They go through mitosis, divide, and turn into osteoblasts. Osteoblasts are the baby cells, B for B. Osteoblasts are the ones that secrete the matrix. The majority of the bone is the matrix. Only about 2 to 3% of the actual tissue are the cells that maintain and secrete the matrix. Osteoblasts turn into osteocytes, and remember those osteocytes form a lacunae, just like when we talked about cartilage. So there are 2 types of cells. When we get into the ground substance and the fibers, remember the cells make the matrix. That's what the matrix is, the fibers and the cells. The cells make the fibers, the 3 types of fibers: collagen, elastic, and reticular. We primarily see a lot of collagen because it gives us that tensile strength. When we look at the ground substance, now we get into seeing the actual hardened material, the mineralization, and that's with calcium compounds, mostly calcium phosphate and calcium carbonate that gives us the strength. But when we look at spongy tissue, we're seeing it to where it's literally like a sponge. I can't see through it, so if you have a bone in the classroom, you can't see through the spongy bone, but I can see that it's porous. Just like when you have a sponge on your kitchen sink that you use to wash your dishes, it's porous, and we know that because the water and soap will run through it, but I can't physically see through it. Spongy's the same way. And all those little pieces of the sponge form into what we call spicules, and then they branch off and turn into trabeculae. So spicules and trabeculae, you may see interchangeably. Most books discuss trabeculae the most, but it's the functional pieces to create the overall sponge of spongy bone. Where do we see it the most? When I look at long bones, and I show you the two arrows here, this is where we see it mostly in the epiphysis, or epiphyses for plural, which is the end of the bone. So when we talked about one of our primary functions of bone, it's blood formation. So we see a lot of blood in this area. We see yellow marrow in the shaft or the diaphysis. If I broke open a bone, they would bleed blood out of the epiphysis because I know this is filled with what we call red bone marrow. So where we see that spongy tissue is in the epiphyses of the ends of long bones, and it varies from bone to bone. As we look over to the histology, and I look at the branching of the tree, and that's all this light pink here, this is all the spicules that have grown together to become trabeculae. To me, it's like looking at branches of the tree. The spaces in between are looking at like you're looking at the holes inside the bone tissue. And this is where we see blood or red bone marrow. If I went on a higher magnification, that would be this picture on this side. So if I just take one little section of this tissue, now we're looking at one big piece of a spicule or trabeculae. So the cells within it, remember the cells that hug towards the middle of the tissue are osteocytes and lacunae. It's the cells within a bubble. And remember when we talked about the matrix, most of the bone is the matrix. So when I look at this, all of this light pink is the matrix that's been made by all of these round little structures, which are the cells, specifically osteocytes and the lacunae. So our osteocytes are our older cells. Along the periphery or edge of the tissue, I'm going to see osteoblasts. The osteoblasts migrate and get older and become the osteocytes. And then I can see where it's porous and I have some of that red bone marrow. So the type of tissue is spongy bone. So understand your terminology. Type of tissue, spongy bone. The cells, osteocytes, they sit in a little bubble enclosed in a cavity called a lacunae. Cells towards the periphery of the structure, osteoblasts. Everything else in between is mostly that red bone marrow that's contributing to the function of tissue. This is spongy bone.